let's give a round of applause for Robert Gardner.
Can you hear me okay? Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. I suppose it's probably right that I start with my connection with Redmaids. And it goes back to 1900. My great-great-grandfather was a gardener here on the grounds before Redmaids moved to this school. His son, my great-grandfather, painted that picture, which now hangs in the living room wall with my mum and dad. And his daughter, my grandmother, came to this school in the 1930s. My mum, my auntie were here in the 1960s, and my sister was here in the 1990s. I'm sure you can find their faces outside on the walls. And I went to QEH school just down the road. So 130 years worth of connection with Redmaids School. And the topic I'm going to talk about today is about nature and the loss of nature. And I want us to think what the world will look like in 2150, 125 years from now, and what difference we want to make. Now, the reason why that's important, over the timeline from my great-grandfather to today, we have this phenomenon called the shifting baseline, which means we're only used to seeing what is in front of us. We can't imagine what the world used to look like. Now, the reality is, for the world of my great-grandfather and my grandfather, there was a lot more biodiversity, a lot more nature on the planet and in the UK than there is today. And over that period, we have lost over half of the biodiversity in the UK, which is tragic and also has a serious impact on the health and well-being of us as a planet going forward. And I want to unpack all of that for you today. And it's no time like today to do something about it. Now, my background is, after studying A-levels, I went on to study geography, and I was part of what was called the Alpine Glacier Project. And the glacier behind me is a photo I took in 1999 of Findellen Glacier facing the Matterhorn in Zermatt. And the photo next to it is literally last year. That glacier has gone. That glacier and many glaciers across the Alps have disappeared far faster than I ever thought they would 25 years ago. Now, not only is it sad to lose these beautiful glaciers, but they really matter because all of the fresh water across Europe depends on these alpine glaciers. The electricity we generate in Switzerland is dependent on these glaciers. So Grundig-Sons, which is the electricity provider in Switzerland, a lot of their electricity comes from what's called hydroelectric power. They are seeing a significant drop in their ability to produce electricity as a direct consequence of the loss of the glaciers. Now, the sad truth is that the loss of biodiversity and glaciers and everything else that we're about to see is a result of us, humans. But we can do something about it. So, quick question. For the next 20 minutes, how much water do you think will melt in the next 20 minutes from the Greenland glaciers? I won't ask you, but just have a think. Think of the biggest number you can imagine. But I bet you weren't thinking of this number. 17 trillion liters of water will disappear in the next 20 minutes as a direct consequence of climate change. Sorry, 20 trillion. So it's about 17 million bottles of water every second. At the same time, in my lifetime, since the 1970s, we have lost 70% of all wildlife on this planet. Giraffes, polar bears, butterflies, worms, and insects. Now, I just want you to imagine if you came to school tomorrow, well, next week, and 70% of the sixth form was missing, or 70% of the staff were missing. I'm pretty sure if I spoke to your head afterwards, this school couldn't function if it lost 70% of its staff. But this is where we are right now as a planet in the UK. So I think we face two problems: climate change and biodiversity loss. And I think we face a trilemma. The first trilemma is that our insatiable demand is outstripping the resources that the planet has to give us. So if we go back to my great-great-grandfather, population, economy, and nature were all in balance. Since 1970, we've seen population growth go from about 3.5 billion to 8 billion. We've seen global GDP go from about $20 trillion to $100 trillion. We've seen the market capitalization of the biggest companies in the world, Microsoft and Google, go from 1 trillion to 100 trillion. We should pat ourselves on the back. This has been phenomenally successful. However, it has come at a cost because we are depleting nature. And that's because we have juxtaposed profit versus our planet. And here's the frightening thing. As we look forward, research from PwC shows that 55%, so over half our economy, is highly dependent on nature and the health of nature. Arguably, our entire health of our planet is dependent on nature. S&P Global have said that 85% of the biggest companies in the world are highly dependent on nature, so that we know that the health of nature isn't just something we want to be nice with David Attenborough, but actually our economy and our future society depends on it. And what I want to land with you today, that actually we want to reframe things, because at the moment we value nature as worthless. And I want you to walk out of today with this big idea that nature is the most valuable asset on the planet. And I want to use examples of how we can start to invest in protecting and restoring nature. In fact, the European Central Bank just did a report back over the summer saying that 75%, that's 4 trillion euros worth of loans here in Europe, are again highly exposed to nature. So this really matters. And I love this stat. So this is from Tony Juniper, and he says that the value of our bees and pollinating insects is worth about £700 million a year to our economy. Now, the frightening thing is if they all died, one bumblebee nest to replace it would require hiring 20 people, which is something that happened in China. In China, they lost all their bees and pollinating insects, and they have to hand pollinate the plants. That cost would be £1.8 billion. So hopefully I'm landing the point that nature is really valuable. So we need to move from an economy which is out of balance with nature. We have a global economy which is maybe $85 to $100 trillion, and we have nature. And research shows that if we were to value the ecosystem services of nature, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the pollinators, the flood protection, the drought protection, everything that nature gives us, our medicine, is worth about $140 trillion. And what we want to see is a world where we rebalance the two, that our economic growth and prosperity is in balance with nature. Now, how do we end up here? Now, if you're studying A-level economics, you know that most companies have to produce what's called a balance sheet and a profit and loss account. And the issue is that up until now, people who run companies are focused on the financial performance of their business. How many widgets did I sell? How much revenues did I produce? What were my costs and what were my profits? But there's no account for the negative externalities. How many plastic bottles have I created that are now in the ocean? How much CO2 am I producing that's going into the air? How many chemicals am I producing that I'm just dumping into the rivers? These are called negative externalities. And we're at a massive pivot point because for the first time in history, these negative externalities are going to be put on to the balance sheets of these companies. Because the truth is, the world affects our companies. Literally today, there is flooding in Bristol. All over the UK, we're seeing flooding. So we know that what happens to our planet impacts our supply chains, impacts our ability to do business. And at the same time, we know that the companies that we invest in, that we buy from, are also having an impact on the planet. And so new regulation is coming in, which is forcing people to really understand these climate risks and these losses to biodiversity and nature and say, how does that financially impact your business? This is huge and will change everything. So if you're running a large company, you're thinking about your revenues into the future. How many widgets am I going to sell? How many revenues am I going to make next year, in 2025, in 2030? And I need to ask myself, but how dependent are my revenues, my supply chain on nature? What impact am I having? What are the risks if these things change? And actually, what are the opportunities if I invest in nature? So to just unpack that, Tesla, an incredibly successful company, is highly dependent on water. It has just built one of the largest factories, car manufacturing plants, in the world, in Germany, and their biggest problem is that they don't have enough water or access to water to manufacture their cars. And it's in conflict with the people who live on the outskirts of Berlin and Brandenburg, who also need that water to live and survive. The same, by the way, is happening in Mexico, where it's not just Tesla, but it's also Heineken and Coca-Cola competing for water with the people who live there. What about impact? So this company, Arrowhead, used to be owned by Nestle USA and is in California. And these guys have been taking out 58 million gallons of water a year, bottling it and selling it to people, but directly impacting the level of drought that is happening in that part of California. Is that right? If you go and Google this afterwards, you'll see there's a big debate about whether they should be doing that. And then Ruinart Champagne, the oldest champagne house in the world. They have material climate and biodiversity risks. So between 1960 and 1990, and then 1990 to today, the temperature in that region has gone up by 1.2 degrees C. Now, for those of you who know how to make champagne, normally when you finish it, you need to put a bit of sugar in right at the end of the fermentation, and that's what gives it that champagne flavor to balance out the acidity. Now, the grapes are getting so ripe, and they're having to harvest them earlier and earlier, but because they're so ripe, they're sweeter and sweeter, and they no longer need to add sugar to make brut champagne. So Ruinart House needs to look out to the future and say, will we even be able to produce champagne 25, 50 years from now? And then finally, what about if we thought about nature as an opportunity? This is a river in Florida where in the 1960s we thought the smart thing to do was canalize it and remove all the meanders, and then we realized the negative impacts that they've had, and actually they've just restored the river and seen huge gains in biodiversity, in flood prevention and drought prevention in that area. Now, the good news is, remember I talked about that financial disclosure. It's beginning to happen. Big companies like AXA, Iberdrola in Spain, UBS in Switzerland are starting to look at their business and report back not just on their financial performance, but what is the impact they have on nature, and vice versa, how dependent are they on nature. So we've got these two powerful forces happening. We've got this thing called greening finance, bringing those negative externalities onto the balance sheet so people can go, what is my resilience of my business over the next 5, 10, 20 years? And then all of a sudden, I don't look at nature as a commodity that I can just extract for free, which has really been the mindset of the last 100 years. And I start to think about nature. And actually, I like to frame it this way. If we imagine nature as a service, we've been on the freemium model of nature for the last 3.5 billion years. But it's about time we start paying for the premium model of nature. So if we want clean air, if we want clean water, if we want bees and pollinators, we need to pay for that service. And I call that financing green. And once we start to finance green, suddenly nature goes from being worthless to being worth $140 trillion, arguably the most valuable asset on the planet. Now, this is where money as a force for good comes in. And as you get older and go to work, you'll hopefully open a pension. And traditionally, you put your pension, you put it with a pension provider, Legal & General, Scottish Widows. They put it with an asset manager, and they invest in those companies we were talking about earlier. And going forward, your pension will do two things differently. It will engage with those companies. It will speak to the CEO and the chair and saying, what are you doing about these dependencies, about these risks? How are you looking at these opportunities? And at the same time, your pension funds will start to invest in nature. We're already seeing some of the large local authority pension funds in London. We're beginning to see the Zurich pension fund actually invest in nature as an asset class. So what does that look like? So just the way I think of an asset is an asset typically has three things. It has utility, it has cash flow, and sometimes it might have scarcity. Think about buying a house. You can live in it, you can rent it out. When you rent it out, you get money. If your house is somewhere rare, like in the south of France, it's worth a lot of money. So think about seagrass. I love seagrass. Now, seagrass, each hectare of seagrass supports 80,000 fish, 1 million invertebrates. It captures carbon, it cleans the water, and it protects our coasts. Is it scarce? When my great-grandfather was gardening here, we used to have 80,000 hectares teeming with fish around the UK coastline. Today, we just have 8,000, so it's definitely scarce. And is it valuable? Well, yes, it's valuable, because actually we should be paying $50 a ton just to capture the carbon. Imagine if we doubled the amount of seagrass we had, just how much fish we could have. Just think about how many sustainable fishing jobs we could have. We could grow our fishing industry and all of the benefits that go with that. So hopefully you can see that seagrass is valuable. And people are beginning to do this. Aviva have committed to invest £100 million in nature here in the UK. But we can't just think of these things as individual items like seagrass, because trying to protect and restore seagrass doesn't work, because guess what? Our rivers are filthy. And if we plant new seagrass, some of you might go on to the University of Plymouth and study marine biology or marine geology, that seagrass won't survive because our rivers are full of effluent. So we literally need to go upstream. So we're working on a source-to-sea project where we recover the entire catchment, the peatlands, the rivers, the farmlands, so that then we can help protect and restore the marine ecosystem in Plymouth Sound. And this really matters because flood risk is a clear and present danger to the people who live there. A huge part of our agriculture, the food that we eat, the food that we buy in Tesco's and Sainsbury's and Waitrose, comes from this part of the UK, and it's exposed to both flooding and drought. Now, as I said earlier, what are the opportunities to reinvest? What if we took our rivers, and we can't restore them to the way they were, but we can let rivers be dynamic the way they're meant to be, and not canalized the way they are today, because only 1% of our floodplains in the UK are actually functioning the way they were meant to be functioning 200 years ago. So in a world where we have more flooding, where we have more drought, where we have dirty water, why wouldn't we want to protect and restore those rivers? Because we know that when we canalize those rivers, we made the problem worse, because the water rains, it runs straight off, straight into the canal, and then it floods. Exactly what we've been seeing across the UK over the past few weeks. Just the value of the flood protection is worth billions and billions of pounds. So investing a few £1 million to protect and restore a River Plym, the River Yelm, maybe even the River Tamar, can be transformative for the people who live in Plymouth. And when we do that, we can get the companies who benefit from that, South West Water, the Environment Agency no longer need to dredge, England Highways no longer need to repair their roads, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Nestle, Arla all benefit because those rivers are full of life. You've got insects, we've got trout back, we've got salmon back. So you've got a healthier environment, you've got better soil quality, so their food is more, or their food supply is more resilient. And so we start paying for those ecosystem services. So I want to finish there, and my question to you is we need to do all of this by 2030. Time is running out. So there is no time like the present. And I want to finish on this quote. Whatever you can do or dream, you can. Begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Thank you very much.